Have you ever felt like you're living far below your true potential? Have you ever wondered why, despite believing in God, you still feel powerless against the battles in your life? What if I told you that the power you've been waiting for is already inside you? The enemy wants you to stay weak, to stay afraid, to stay blind to your true identity. But today, that changes. You were not created to live in fear. You were created to be a warrior, a conqueror, a force that shakes the kingdom of darkness. Jesus himself said in Luke 10:19, "Behold, I give unto you power to tread on serpents and scorpions, and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall by any means hurt you." So why are so many believers living as if they are powerless? The answer is simple. Authority that is not activated is wasted. Today, we will dive deep into the truth that the world does not want you to know. You are more powerful than you think, and now is the time to rise. So get ready. By the end of this message, your spirit will be ignited, your mind will be awakened, and you will walk in your divine authority. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss more powerful, life-changing messages like this. Now, let's begin. The night was darker than usual. The wind howled through the trees, carrying whispers that seemed to echo in the depths of his soul. Daniel sat at the edge of his bed, his fingers clenched tightly together. Sleep had eluded him for weeks, but tonight, the heaviness in his spirit felt different, urgent, almost unbearable. He reached for his Bible, flipping through the well-worn pages, searching for an answer, for clarity. As his eyes landed on Luke 10:19, his breath caught in his throat. "Behold, I give unto you power to tread on serpents and scorpions, and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall by any means hurt you." A shiver ran down his spine. He had read this verse countless times before, yet tonight it was as if God himself had underlined it, spoken it directly into his heart. Could it be? Had he been living beneath his calling all this time? A voice, not audible but undeniable, stirred within him. "You were never meant to live in fear." The words struck him like thunder, igniting something deep inside, a realization that sent his heart racing. You were created to walk in dominion, to break chains, to shift atmospheres. But how? He had spent his life as an ordinary man, waking up, working, paying bills, and going to church on Sundays. He had prayed, yes. He had believed, yes. But he had never truly activated the power within him. A sudden knock on the door shattered the silence. "Daniel?" It was Pastor Thomas, his voice steady but urgent. Daniel rushed to open it, and the pastor stepped inside, his face lined with something Daniel couldn't quite place: concern, anticipation, or maybe both. He held out a small, leather-bound book, ancient in its appearance. "I was praying," Pastor Thomas said, his gaze piercing, "and the Lord led me here. He told me, Daniel is ready." "Ready for what?" Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper. The pastor smiled, but it wasn't a smile of comfort. It was a knowing, a declaration. To step into who you were always meant to be. Daniel swallowed hard. He wanted to argue, to say he was just an ordinary man, but something inside of him, something deeper than fear, told him otherwise. Could it be true? Had he been chosen for something greater? Pastor Thomas opened the book, revealing a passage in Ephesians 3:20. "Now unto him that is able to do exceeding abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that worketh in us." "The power is already in you, Daniel," the pastor said firmly. "The only question is, will you activate it?" Daniel felt the weight of those words settle into his bones. It was as if everything in his life had led to this moment, as if every unanswered prayer, every trial, every whisper of doubt had all been pointing him to this realization. He had been waiting for God to move, but God had been waiting for him. His hands trembled as he reached for the book, feeling the weight of destiny pressing down on him. He thought of every time he had prayed for strength, for clarity, for purpose. He thought of the times he had allowed fear to paralyze him, to keep him from stepping forward. No more. The moment he made that decision, something inside him shifted. It wasn't a loud explosion, no supernatural lightning strike, but rather a quiet, undeniable certainty, the kind that changes a man forever. Pastor Thomas saw it. He nodded. Then it begins. A deep breath filled Daniel's lungs as he whispered, "I'm ready." But was he truly? He didn't know. All he knew was that for the first time in his life he was no longer waiting. He was moving. And heaven was moving with him. The morning sun pierced through the heavy clouds, casting a golden glow over the quiet town. Daniel sat by his window, the events of the night still fresh in his mind. He had said he was ready, but was he truly? The question lingered like a shadow over his soul. A knock at the door startled him. "Daniel," Pastor Thomas greeted, stepping inside. His presence carried the same urgency as the night before. "You felt it, didn't you? The shift within?" Daniel nodded slowly. "I don't know how to explain it, but something changed. I feel different." The pastor smiled. "That's the awakening, but now comes the battle." Daniel frowned. "Battle?" Pastor Thomas pulled a small Bible from his pocket, flipping it open to Ephesians 6:12. "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." Daniel exhaled sharply. "So, this isn't just about me finding my purpose." "No," the pastor said, his tone grave. "It's about warfare. When God calls someone, the enemy takes notice, and he doesn't just sit back and let you step into your power, he fights. Hard." A chill ran down Daniel's spine. "So, what do I do?" "You prepare." The pastor's gaze was unwavering. "The enemy will come for you with fear, doubt, distractions, anything to keep you from stepping into your calling. That's why you must arm yourself." He placed the Bible into Daniel's hands, turning to Ephesians 6:13-17. "Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand." Daniel read the words aloud, his voice steadying. "The belt of truth, the breastplate of righteousness, the shield of faith, the helmet of salvation, the sword of the Spirit." "That's your armor," the pastor confirmed. "But armor alone doesn't win battles. You must fight. And your greatest weapon? Prayer." Daniel swallowed hard. He had prayed before, but never like this. Never with the understanding that his prayers weren't just requests, they were declarations, weapons against the darkness. "The moment you said 'I'm ready' last night," the pastor continued, "a war was declared. The enemy knows who you are now. He will come for you, but he will not win, unless you let him." A sudden noise from outside made them both turn. A figure stood at the end of the street, watching. Daniel felt a strange unease settle in his chest. "Who is that?" Pastor Thomas narrowed his eyes. "Not who, what?" Daniel's pulse quickened. "You mean—" "Yes," the pastor said firmly. "The battle has already begun." For the first time, Daniel truly understood. This wasn't just about him. This was bigger. This was war, and he had just stepped onto the battlefield. Daniel stood frozen at the doorway, his breath shallow as he locked eyes with the figure at the end of the street. A deep sense of unease crawled up his spine. It wasn't just the man's presence, it was what Daniel felt emanating from him. Darkness, tangible and suffocating. "Pastor Thomas? Who is that?" Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper. Pastor Thomas didn't immediately answer. Instead, he stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the figure. "The enemy sends messengers before he launches an attack," he finally said. "He wants to intimidate you, to make you second-guess what God has already spoken over your life, but you must not give him that power." Daniel swallowed hard. The words from the night before echoed in his mind. The battle has already begun. He had accepted the call, but now reality was staring back at him. Was he truly ready for this? The figure took a step closer, and Daniel felt a cold wind whip through the street. The sky, once streaked with the light of dawn, now seemed heavier, darker. "Remember, Daniel," Pastor Thomas said, placing a firm hand on his shoulder, "we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness in this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." Ephesians 6:12. Daniel inhaled sharply. He had read that verse countless times, but never had it felt so real. The figure moved again. This time, Daniel felt something invisible press against him. A weight, oppressive and stifling. Doubts began to creep in. What if I'm not strong enough? What if I fail? Then, suddenly, Pastor Thomas's voice rang out, firm and unwavering. "In the name of Jesus, you have no power here." The air shifted. It was subtle, but Daniel felt it, like a crack in the oppressive force around him. A moment later, the figure flinched, pausing in his steps. "Daniel," the pastor said, turning to him, "the enemy's greatest weapon is fear. But fear is a liar. You must learn to fight, not with your strength, but with the authority God has already placed inside you." Daniel clenched his fists, feeling a strange warmth stir in his chest. His mind flashed back to the verse he had read the night before. "Behold, I give unto you power, and nothing shall by any means hurt you." Luke 10:19. He stepped forward, barely aware of what he was doing. The figure's eyes locked onto him, but Daniel refused to look away. "You are not welcome here," he said, his voice firm despite the racing of his heart. "I stand in the authority of Jesus Christ." The figure snarled, and for a moment, Daniel thought it would charge toward him. But then, as if restrained by an unseen force, it took a slow step back. Then another, and another, then it was gone. The wind stilled. The heaviness lifted, and Daniel stood there, breathless but victorious. Pastor Thomas placed a hand on his back. "You see? The power isn't in the words alone, Daniel. It's in the faith behind them, the authority behind them, and you have that authority." Daniel exhaled slowly, his mind reeling. He had won his first battle, but deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. The air inside the small house was thick with an unspoken tension. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of lukewarm coffee. His victory from the previous night should have filled him with confidence, but instead he felt a deep, lingering unease. Was he truly ready for what lay ahead? Pastor Thomas sat across from him, his Bible open, flipping through the pages with steady hands. "You did well, Daniel," he finally said, his voice calm yet firm. "But this was only the first step." Daniel exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if I can do this, Pastor. I barely got through last night. What if next time I fail?" The pastor's eyes met his, unwavering. "You won't fail if you remember where your strength comes from. It was never about you. It was always about him." Daniel swallowed hard. He wanted to believe that, but the weight of what had happened still clung to him. He had spoken with authority, yes. The figure had retreated. But what if next time it didn't? What if the enemy came back stronger? Pastor Thomas seemed to sense his turmoil. He turned his Bible to 2 Corinthians 12:9 and read aloud, "My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." Daniel closed his eyes, letting the words sink in. The enemy wanted him to focus on his limitations, but God was calling him to trust in divine strength. A sudden knock at the door jolted them both. Daniel tensed, his pulse quickening. Pastor Thomas stood first, motioning for Daniel to stay put. He opened the door to reveal Sarah, a woman from the congregation, her eyes wide with fear. She stepped inside hastily, her voice shaking. "Pastor, something is wrong." Daniel stood, his unease deepening. "What happened?" Sarah clasped her hands together. "It's my brother Caleb. He hasn't been himself. He won't eat, won't speak, and when he does, it's not him. His voice, his eyes, everything is different. I don't know what to do." A chill ran through Daniel. He had heard stories like this before, but now, standing on the other side, he realized this was real. Pastor Thomas nodded solemnly. "We need to go to him." Daniel hesitated. Fear threatened to creep in again. He wasn't ready for this. He had barely found his footing in this battle, and now they were being called into another one. But then he remembered, "Behold, I give unto you power." Luke 10:19. He took a deep breath. "Let's go." Sarah led them through the streets, her steps quick with urgency. The sun was high, but the closer they got to her home, the heavier the air became. By the time they reached the front door, Daniel could feel it, a darkness lurking just beyond the threshold. Sarah hesitated, gripping the doorknob. "He's inside." Daniel glanced at Pastor Thomas. The older man nodded, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Remember, Daniel, you do not fight alone." Daniel swallowed his fear and stepped forward. The battle wasn't just coming, it was already here. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room. The air was thick, almost suffocating, carrying an unnatural stillness that made Daniel's stomach churn. Every instinct in him screamed to turn back, but he knew he couldn't. Not now. Sarah's brother, Caleb, sat hunched in the far corner of the room, his body tense, his face partially hidden in the shadows. His breathing was slow, heavy, almost unnatural. The sight of him sent chills down Daniel's spine. "Caleb?" Sarah's voice trembled as she took a cautious step forward. No response. Pastor Thomas entered the room with quiet authority, his presence anchoring Daniel's wavering resolve. "We come in the name of Jesus," the pastor declared, his voice steady but firm. "Darkness has no place here." At those words, Caleb lifted his head. But it wasn't just Caleb anymore. His eyes, once warm and familiar, were now cold, hollow, filled with something Daniel couldn't quite describe, something ancient and angry. A low, guttural chuckle escaped Caleb's lips. "You think you have power?" The voice that came out wasn't his own. It was deeper, layered, echoing as if spoken from somewhere beyond him. Sarah gasped, covering her mouth. Tears welled up in her eyes, a mixture of fear and heartbreak. "Caleb, please." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. This was no ordinary struggle. This was a direct confrontation with something unseen but undeniably real. He could feel it pressing against him, whispering lies, sowing doubt. "You're not strong enough. You don't belong here. Leave before it's too late." He clenched his fists. Number. Not this time. Pastor Thomas took a step closer, opening his Bible. "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." Ephesians 6:12. The entity inside Caleb recoiled slightly. A flicker of something, was it fear, passing through his expression. Daniel swallowed hard. "You have no authority here. Caleb belongs to God." Caleb let out a sharp, inhuman scream, his body convulsing violently. The room seemed to shake, a gust of unseen wind swirling around them. Sarah cried out, stumbling backward. Pastor Thomas remained unmoved. "In the name of Jesus Christ, come out of him." The atmosphere grew thick with tension. Caleb clutched his head, shaking violently. The battle waged within him was visible, raw, and excruciating. Daniel felt something stir deep inside him. A fire, an unshakable boldness he had never known before. He stepped forward, his voice stronger than he expected. "Caleb, listen to me. You are loved. You are chosen. The enemy cannot have you." Another piercing scream erupted from Caleb's throat, his body collapsing onto the floor. The wind stopped. The heaviness lifted. And then, silence. Sarah rushed to his side, cradling him in her arms. "Caleb! Caleb!" A ragged breath escaped his lips. His eyes fluttered open, and this time, they were his again. Tears streamed down his face as he clung to his sister, sobbing uncontrollably. Daniel staggered back, his legs weak beneath him. It was over. The darkness had been driven out. Pastor Thomas placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You see, Daniel, the power wasn't in you. It was in him all along." Daniel exhaled deeply, his heart still racing. He had just witnessed a battle not of flesh and blood, but of spirit, and for the first time, he truly understood the weight of his calling. This wasn't just about him. This was about souls, and the battle had only just begun. The silence in the room was thick, yet it carried a profound sense of peace. The battle was over, but its echoes still lingered in Daniel's heart. His hands trembled slightly as he watched Sarah cradle Caleb, whispering words of reassurance, her tears soaking his shirt. Caleb's breathing was steady now, though his body remained weak. He looked up at Daniel, eyes filled with something between exhaustion and gratitude. "What? What happened to me?" Daniel hesitated. How could he explain it? How could he put into words the invisible war that had just been waged over his very soul? Pastor Thomas knelt beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You were under attack, Caleb. The enemy sought to claim you, but he failed, because Jesus never lets go of his own." Caleb swallowed hard, his eyes flickering with remembrance. I could hear things, feel things. It was like I was trapped inside my own mind, but something else was speaking through me." His voice cracked. I was terrified. Sarah tightened her grip around him. "You're safe now, Caleb. You're free." Pastor Thomas nodded. "But freedom isn't just about this moment. It's about walking in it, living in it. The enemy may retreat, but he never gives up. You must stay guarded." Daniel sat back, his mind reeling. He had seen spiritual warfare before, but never like this. Never so direct, so raw. He had spoken in faith, but deep inside he wondered, what if next time his faith wasn't enough? What if the battle was greater than him? Pastor Thomas seemed to read his thoughts. "Daniel, do you remember when Jesus sent out his disciples? He didn't send them out without preparation. He gave them authority." Daniel nodded slowly. The pastor continued, flipping to Luke 10:19. "Behold, I give unto you power to tread on serpents and scorpions, and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall by any means hurt you." Daniel's breath hitched. That verse had followed him since the beginning of this journey. And yet, standing here, witnessing this battle firsthand, he realized he was still only scratching the surface of what it truly meant. Caleb sat up slightly, his expression troubled. "But what if it comes back?" Sarah tensed beside him, but Pastor Thomas remained steady. "Then you stand firm. You fight with prayer, with truth, with the Word. This battle was won, but there will be more. The enemy doesn't go after those who are lost in the world. He fights against those who are stepping into God's calling." Daniel looked between them, his resolve settling deeper. "Then we make sure we're ready." A warmth spread through his chest, an assurance that he wasn't fighting alone, that none of them were. Sarah wiped away her tears, nodding. "We stand together." Caleb exhaled shakily, then gave a weak but genuine smile. "Then let's make sure he never wins again." Pastor Thomas smiled, standing tall. "Good. Then let's begin." A new battle awaited, but they were no longer unprepared. This time, they knew who they were. The night was calm, yet Daniel's heart was anything but. He sat outside the church, staring up at the sky, his mind racing. The past few days had been unlike anything he had ever experienced. He had witnessed the power of God in a way he had only read about in Scripture. But something inside him still felt unprepared. Footsteps approached from behind. Pastor Thomas took a seat next to him, his expression gentle but knowing. "You're thinking about what's next, aren't you?" Daniel let out a slow breath. "I know what we did was real. I know God's power is greater than the enemy. But Pastor, what if I fail? What if next time I don't know what to do?" The older man nodded thoughtfully, flipping open his Bible. "You're not the first to feel this way, Daniel. Even the great men of faith had doubts. But God doesn't call the equipped, He equips the called." Daniel looked at him, waiting. Pastor Thomas turned to Isaiah 41:10 and read, "Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you, I will help you, I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." The words sank deep into Daniel's soul. He had read them before, but tonight they carried a new weight. God would uphold him. Just then, the church doors creaked open. Sarah stepped out, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the streetlights. "Pastor, Daniel, something's happening. Caleb's awake, and he says he has something to tell us." Daniel's stomach tightened. He exchanged a glance with Pastor Thomas before standing. "Let's go." Inside, Caleb sat at the front of the sanctuary, his eyes filled with something Daniel hadn't seen before: clarity. "I remember everything," Caleb began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "When the darkness had me, I could hear it: whispers, lies, fear. But I also heard something else, something stronger, a voice telling me to hold on, telling me that I was not alone." Sarah squeezed his hand, tears brimming in her eyes. "God was fighting for you." Caleb nodded, exhaling shakily. "And I believe I was supposed to go through that battle, not just for myself but for others. There are people out there trapped like I was, believing they're too far gone. But they're not. They just don't know the truth." A beat of silence passed before Pastor Thomas spoke. "And what do you think God is telling you to do?" Caleb looked up, his expression unwavering. "To tell them. To help free them, just like I was freed." Daniel felt something stir within him. This was why they were here, not just to fight battles, but to lead others to freedom. Pastor Thomas smiled. "Then let's not waste time. The harvest is plenty, but the workers are few." Daniel clenched his fists, but this time, it wasn't out of fear. It was determination. He was ready. They all were. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew-drenched earth. Daniel walked alongside Pastor Thomas, his heart still processing the weight of the previous night's revelation. Caleb had been freed, and now he wanted to help others. But the road ahead would not be easy. "Pastor, what if we fail? What if we don't reach them in time?" Daniel asked, his voice laced with uncertainty. Pastor Thomas gave a knowing smile, his eyes reflecting wisdom forged in battle. "Daniel, the outcome is not in our hands. It never was. Our calling is to obey, to go where God sends us. The rest is up to Him." They approached the church where Caleb and Sarah were waiting. Caleb looked stronger today, his eyes filled with purpose. "I spent the night praying," Caleb said, "and I know now that this calling isn't just about me. It's about all of us. There are people trapped in darkness, just like I was. They need to know that freedom is possible." Daniel nodded, a flicker of determination lighting inside him. "Then we go. But where do we start?" Pastor Thomas turned to Matthew 9:37-38. "The harvest truly is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." He closed the Bible and looked at them. We start with prayer, because before we can step into the battlefield, we need to align our hearts with God's will. The four knelt in the sanctuary, the morning light streaming through the stained glass windows. Their prayers were not just words, they were declarations, battle cries sent into the spiritual realm. They were ready. As they rose, Sarah's phone buzzed. Her face paled as she read the message. "It's from my cousin Mark. He's been having the same dreams Caleb described before everything happened. The voices, the fear. He says he doesn't know what's happening to him. He's scared." A heavy silence settled over the group. Caleb clenched his fists. "Then we don't wait. If the enemy is moving, so are we." Pastor Thomas exhaled deeply. "Then it begins again. But this time, we know who we are. We know who fights for us." Daniel's heart pounded, but it wasn't fear that fueled it now. It was purpose. The war wasn't over. It had only just begun. The drive to Mark's house was eerily silent. The road stretched before them, winding through dense forest that seemed to darken with every passing mile. Daniel gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. The weight of their mission pressed down on him, heavier than ever. Caleb sat beside him, staring out the window, his fingers tapping anxiously against his knee. "I can feel it," he murmured. "The same darkness that tried to take me. It's there." Pastor Thomas, seated in the back, closed his eyes in prayer. "The enemy knows what we're about to do. He will try to shake us, but he cannot stop us." Sarah, clutching her Bible, whispered, "Mark needs us, and we won't let fear hold us back." As they neared the house, the air seemed to grow thick, suffocating. The moment Daniel pulled into the driveway, a sharp chill ran through him. Mark's house stood still, its windows dark despite the morning sun. Something was waiting inside, watching. Sarah was the first to move. "Let's go." They stepped out of the car and the wind howled around them, rustling the trees in an unnatural rhythm. Daniel exchanged a glance with Caleb before knocking firmly on the door. No answer. He knocked again. "Mark? It's us. We're here to help." A long, agonizing silence followed before the door creaked open just an inch. Mark's face appeared, pale, hollow, his eyes sunken. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. But worse than that was the fear in his eyes. A fear Daniel knew all too well. "You shouldn't have come," Mark whispered. Pastor Thomas stepped forward, his voice steady. "We were sent here for a reason, Mark. You are not alone." Mark hesitated, then slowly opened the door wider. The inside of the house was dim, the air thick with something unseen but undeniably present. Shadows clung to the corners, shifting as if alive. "It's been whispering to me," Mark admitted, his voice barely audible. "Telling me things, telling me to give up. I don't know how much longer I can fight." Daniel stepped closer. "You don't have to fight alone. That's why we're here." Mark looked at him, desperation flickering in his gaze. "But what if it's too late? What if I've already let it in?" Pastor Thomas spoke with quiet authority. "It's never too late. Not when Jesus is involved." At that moment, the entire house seemed to tremble. A sharp gust of wind slammed the door shut behind them. Mark gasped, his body tensing as an unseen force gripped him. He staggered backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The atmosphere thickened with an oppressive weight, pressing against them like an unseen storm. Sarah's voice rang out, unwavering. "In the name of Jesus, this house belongs to the Lord. You have no place here." A guttural growl erupted from somewhere unseen, a sound that sent shivers down Daniel's spine. But he didn't back down. Instead, he stepped forward, joining Sarah. "Mark, listen to me," he urged. "God has given you authority over this. You don't have to live in fear anymore. You are His." Mark gasped as if struggling to breathe, his hands gripping his chest. I I want to be free." Pastor Thomas raised his voice, filled with conviction. "Then declare it. Say his name. Call on Jesus." Mark squeezed his eyes shut, tears streaming down his face. "Jesus, Jesus, help me." A sudden force seemed to break. The heaviness shattered, and Mark collapsed to his knees, sobbing. The air in the room shifted, the darkness receding like a tide pulled back by an unseen hand. Daniel fell to his knees beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're free, Mark. He heard you." Tears mixed with relief as Mark looked up at them, his eyes now clear. "Thank you. Thank you all." Pastor Thomas smiled, resting a hand on his Bible. "Don't thank us. Thank the one who never let you go." Outside, the wind had calmed, the sun now shining brightly through the trees. The storm had passed. Victory had come. But they knew this was just the beginning of something greater. The golden hues of sunrise spilled over the quiet town, casting long shadows on the ground. The storm had passed, but the weight of what had just transpired still clung to the air. Mark sat on the church steps, his hands clasped together, his expression one of quiet reflection. He was free, truly free, but the journey ahead still felt uncertain. Daniel approached, his heart full but his mind racing. "How are you feeling?" Mark exhaled deeply, glancing at him. "Lighter, like a weight I didn't even realize I was carrying is finally gone. But what now? What happens after deliverance?" Pastor Thomas, who had been standing nearby, stepped forward. "Now, you walk in the light, Mark. Freedom isn't just about breaking chains. It's about never putting them back on. The enemy will try to whisper doubts, try to convince you that nothing has changed. But you know the truth, and the truth will keep you free." Mark nodded slowly, as if letting the words settle deep into his soul. "I want to help others. I want them to know that they don't have to live in darkness." Sarah smiled, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Then that's where you start. Share your testimony. Tell them what God has done." Daniel glanced toward the distant horizon, a sense of resolve solidifying within him. "This battle wasn't just about you, Mark. It was about all of us. We've been called to something greater, and we can't ignore it anymore." Pastor Thomas pulled his Bible from his coat pocket, flipping to Ephesians 6:10-11. "Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil." He looked up at them, his gaze steady. "The fight is never over. But now you're equipped. You're ready. You've seen the power of God firsthand, and with him, you are unstoppable." A silence settled between them, not one of fear, but of deep understanding. They were no longer the same people they had been before. The darkness had tried to claim them, but the light had prevailed. Mark stood, his eyes clear. "I won't go back. I won't live in fear anymore. I am his." Sarah beamed, tears glistening in her eyes. "That's right, and he will never let you go." The morning sun continued its ascent, bathing them in warmth, a symbol of new beginnings. They had fought, they had won, but they knew. This was just the beginning of the war. As they stood together, bound by faith, Daniel felt something stir deep within him. The world needed to hear the truth. People were waiting, trapped, searching, desperate for hope, and they were ready to bring it. Pastor Thomas smiled knowingly. "Then let's go. There's work to do." With that, they stepped forward, no longer afraid, no longer unsure. They were chosen, and the battle was just beginning.